come here.
No questions? Let me start my screen share. Just to show you, we're going to finish chapter 5. We're almost finished, so we'll probably leave early. Let me remind you that quiz 1 is due at, you can start taking it at midnight tonight, and you need to take it by 11:59 p.m. Friday night. There's no lab today, but we did lab 2 and 3 this week. And there's one other thing I want to talk about. On quiz 1, you do not need to lock down your browser. I've decided that I'm going to have a experiment with locking down the browser on a practice quiz. And nobody told me that there were no questions in the practice quiz. I thought some people would be interested in getting the extra credit point, and then I went and looked in there, and I got the practice quiz up, but there's no questions in it. So something happened when
I answered questions when I took the practice quiz, so it was there when I took it.
I also
Yeah, mine too.
All right, that's interesting. Let me go take a look at that again. So you guys said you took it. I went in and looked in there, and I couldn't find anything. Let's try it. You guys would get in from here. I did it through the quiz link. Where is the link? Is it week 2?
I accessed it through grades.
No, this has got something in it. All right, I will take a look at that. Apparently, I've got more than one practice quiz 1B, and this should be the one that's showing. And apparently, I went into the wrong quiz. So, anyways, the point is, I'll try and make another quiz 1B, or make another quiz, a practice quiz, and then experiment with the Respondus browser lockdown. And you do need to download a program to get it to run. I will not be using the, you can also use a program where it's going to take a picture of you while you're taking the exam, and I could look at you taking the exam for all the time if I wanted to, and I just decided I'm not going to do that. For one thing is I don't want a whole bunch of programs running when you are taking an exam, but I do want to try the browser lockdown, and Yavapai is experimenting with it, and so they actually encouraged me to try it. But I'm not going to have it on your first quiz because I'm not quite ready, and I want to try it with a practice quiz. And it'll be a good idea for you to take that other practice quiz because, for one thing, you'll have to download the browser, Respondus browser lockdown, and then get it running and see how it works. With just that running and the quiz, I think most of you shouldn't have a problem. Okay? But it will lock down the browser until you submit the quiz. And that means, I think, you cannot use your computer for other things. And at the very least, it means you can't use a web browser while you're taking the quiz. Okay? That's all it's doing is locking down the web browser so that you are committed to taking the exam. And I do want to experiment with it, and I will experiment with it on a practice quiz. And then, after the practice quiz, I'm hoping to use it on quiz 2. All right? Any questions about any of that? If not, that's it for what we're going to be doing. So let's go to...
So the quiz that we're taking tomorrow is not Lockdown Browser.
Correct.
Okay.
There we go. So this was the last slide I talked about. Let's move that over just a little bit so I can see it. So we got about, oops, way too many. We have about 7 slides more, maybe 8 slides to go, and then we'll be finished. Metabolic pathways use energy, and in the complete metabolic oxidation of glucose in aerobic respiration, it's the most efficient. It produces 36 to 38 ATP, and if we're talking about prokaryotic cells, they produce 38 ATP per molecule of glucose. The ATP will then be used by the cell for any of its energy needs. It could be for active transport, moving a molecule across the cell membrane, increasing it inside the cell, so it would be a molecule that the cell wants, and pumping it against its concentration gradient. It could be used for movement of the cell or the synthesis of new cellular components in some anabolic reaction, like the making of protein. Most cellular ATP in a cell is used in the process of anabolism. Whenever you're making a larger molecule, it takes energy, and the cell gets that energy from ATP. And that would be like the biosynthesis of a protein, but it could be the biosynthesis of a polysaccharide, or of a lipid, or of a nucleic acid. And all of those are the 4 molecules of life. Any question about any of that? I think I might want to turn off the sound. I'm about to sneeze here. I don't know what's going on, but in the first lesson I blew my nose. Of course, I got out of the video to do that, and now I feel like I'm going to be sneezing. Hopefully I don't do that. If I do, my apologies. The integration of metabolism, we showed you anabolic and catabolic pathways as separate processes. But in reality, they are not separate processes, even in human cells. So anabolic and catabolic pathways are joined together by common intermediates. And whenever you have a pathway that can go either way, like the catabolism of glucose or the catabolism of starch into glucose, it can go the other way, the anabolic process of building up starch from glucose. And those we call amphibolic pathways, metabolic pathways that function in both directions. They can be both catabolic as well as anabolic. And they bridge the pathways involved in carbohydrate, lipid, protein, and nucleic acid metabolism. Like I stated before, whatever you eat, carbohydrates, lipids, or proteins, it can go through aerobic respiration in the pathway that I showed. But the majority of us, when we eat lipids, we don't directly burn lipids by aerobic respiration. We will convert that lipid into glucose and then send glucose through aerobic respiration in the normal way. Okay? And even a marathon runner, I think I mentioned this, when they are running, they don't initially metabolize lipids. It's only 45 minutes into their marathon run that they'll start metabolizing lipids. Everyone got that? So normally, most of us, we will convert the protein and the lipids to a carbohydrate, and then convert the carbohydrate into glucose, and then send glucose through aerobic respiration in the normal way. And that's because most of us are not needing the energy from burning the lipid right away. But in a marathon runner, after 45 minutes, they've used up all the carbohydrates they've got to burn, and then they'll start metabolizing lipids as well as proteins directly. Any question about that? Okay? So normally this metabolism of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, as well as nucleic acids, happens with amphibolic pathways, meaning that they can function in both ways. And so let's look at this slide here, and I know you can't see that because it's too small. And it's not showing it going this way, but that does happen, that fatty acids and glycerol can be combined to make lipids. And you actually know that happens because when we eat a high carbohydrate diet and we're not burning those carbohydrates, it's not going to be stored in your body as a carbohydrate. What's it going to be stored in your body as? Come on, somebody knows.
Fat.
Yeah, fat. So it'll be converted into a lipid, and then we'll store it as a lipid. And then when we use that lipid, unless you're a marathon runner, an Olympic athlete, we probably won't burn that lipid directly as, come on, thing, as it's shown here. We'll convert this lipid into a carbohydrate, will then be converted into glucose, and then glucose will go down the pathway in the normal way. Okay, but this is showing you that all of the steps of the Krebs cycle and all of the steps for glycolysis, with the exception of these right here, can be converted and go the both ways. And it's showing you with amino acids that these can go from amino acid to pyruvic acid, but if you want to build up an amino acid, you can convert pyruvic acid into amino acid. And then you can convert, if you eat a high carbohydrate diet, you can convert carbohydrates into amino acids and then build up proteins. Okay? And this is trying to show you that even humans, which are really lousy at integrating metabolism, that we're pretty good at it when it comes to aerobic respiration and the reactions of aerobic respiration, that we can convert carbohydrates to lipids and carbohydrates to proteins, and then we can also convert proteins into carbohydrates and lipids into carbohydrates. Any question about that? That's really all you need to know, and that is that humans, which are really lousy at converting molecules, can convert carbohydrates to proteins and into lipids, and lipids into carbohydrates, and proteins into carbohydrates. Okay? So we can do that, and microorganisms and plants are much better at doing that than humans are. Plants can generally make any molecule they want from CO2 and water, and how they do that is they convert the CO2 and the water into glucose, and then they convert the glucose nearly to any molecule that they want. So plants can build up practically any molecule that they want. There are some exceptions, but for most molecules that the plant wants, they can build it up from glucose. And if they can't make it, then we would call that something like an essential fatty acid for that plant, or an essential amino acid for the plant, and they have to get that from their environment. And plants are just in the soil. They're not going to find many amino acids or many fatty acids in the soil. And that's why humans have a lot more essential amino acids and essential fatty acids. Those are ones that we must obtain from our diet. I used to know an amino acid. Let me see if I can remember it. An essential amino acid. I'm drawing a blank here. I think an essential fatty acid that we have to have in our diet is arachidonic acid. And I'm drawing a blank now on the essential amino acid. Nope, I don't remember. Anyways, we have to have those in our diet, and plants can make them. Like green plants, they can make vitamin C. We have to get vitamin C in our diet, and all the vitamins we have to get in our diet. That's why we call them vitamins. All right, any questions about any of that part? Okay, if not, let's move on to another topic, photosynthesis. We've talked about how mostly microorganisms, but our cells can generate ATP from the catabolism of glucose, and most cells can generate ATP from catabolizing glucose. And that's true of green plants. If you're up in Point Barrow, Alaska, they have a winter where for 3 months of the year there's no sunlight. Okay? And what does the green plant do in Point Barrow, Alaska when it's a nighttime for 3 months of the winter, meaning there's no sunlight in the night? And what they do for their energy needs is they will catabolize glucose for their energy needs. And all green plants do that whenever light isn't shining. They will use light to make glucose, or at least they can. And when they need energy and there's no light around, like during the night, they will catabolize glucose to make ATP. Any question about any of that? So if you have any houseplants during the night, assuming you don't have your lights on, when there's no light on the plant, if the plant cell needs energy, it will get the energy from the catabolism of glucose. And green plants will engage in aerobic respiration, just like your cells will. They also can make ATP by photosynthesis. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. I want to talk about what photosynthesis is. It's the conversion of light energy into chemical energy. Usually green plants will convert light into glucose, but it can be a chemical form of energy. How that's done is that the light energy is used to convert atmospheric CO2 and water into glucose. And that is very important for life, because all of us that eat other things, meaning if we don't make our own food, we rely on photosynthetic organisms for our energy needs. And yes, you can say, well, I get it from a cow, so that's where I'm getting my energy needs. I eat the cow. But in reality, the cow is getting it from grass, and grass is getting its energy needs from fixing carbon dioxide in the air and water to glucose by photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is performed in more than just green plants. You probably know it's performed in algae and it's performed in the photosynthetic bacteria, such as cyanobacteria. And there are a lot of photosynthetic bacteria. Most of the bacteria are either a decomposer or a producer, and most of the producers are photosynthetic bacteria, although there are some producers which are chemosynthetic bacteria, and I've already talked a little bit about chemosynthetic bacteria. They can fix carbon dioxide into glucose, and where they get their energy needs is from an inorganic chemical molecule. And we're not going to talk about that right now because I'm talking about photosynthetic organisms, and they get their energy needs from the energy in light. Photosynthesis is a mechanism for synthesizing all of the organic compounds that are required by animals and other living forms that rely on photosynthesis. Okay? Any question about any of that? Photosynthesis only occurs in photosynthetic organisms, and photosynthetic organisms have light-trapping pigments. One of them you know is chlorophyll. The light energy from the light energy stimulates an electron in chlorophyll, and then the green plant or other photosynthetic organism uses the electron coming from chlorophyll to fix carbon dioxide into glucose. Normally, in the production of glucose, the light energy is first converted into the energy of ATP and or NADPH, but then the ATP and NADPH are used to fix glucose from CO2 and water. And we call the fixing of glucose from CO2 and water carbon fixation. Changing CO2 and carbon, changing the carbon in CO2 into the carbon in glucose. Any questions about any of that? All right, so this is the photosynthesis that you probably have heard in the past. Well, let me tell you that there are actually two types of photosynthesis. There's cyclic photosynthesis, and there's non-cyclic photosynthesis. You have only probably heard of non-cyclic photosynthesis, and they simply called it photosynthesis. In non-cyclic photosynthesis, the summary equation is 6 carbon dioxide molecules, 12 water molecules, in the presence of light, can be converted into glucose, C6H12O6, and 6 oxygen molecules and 6 water molecules. Sometimes you'll see this reaction where they subtract 6 water molecules from the right, and then they subtract 6 water molecules from the left. I prefer this reaction because if you look at where all of the oxygen came from in photosynthesis, as 12 atoms of oxygen, all of those atoms of oxygen came from the 12 water molecules. Why I prefer it with this reaction rather than reducing the 6 water molecules here and 6 water molecules there. All of the atoms of oxygen come from the atoms of water. None of the atoms of oxygen come from the oxygen and CO2. All of the CO2 is converted into glucose or water. Any question about that? That's non-cyclic photosynthesis, and you do need to know non-cyclic photosynthesis where you're making oxygen. You don't need to know anaerobic phototrophs, which make carbon dioxide, they make glucose from carbon dioxide, but they're not using water and they're not generating oxygen. They're actually generating sulfur, and you just don't need to know this. This is another form that microorganisms have for engaging in non-cyclic photosynthesis, but we're not going to talk about it. Any questions about non-cyclic photosynthesis? Now, there is another form of photosynthesis, and it's called cyclic photosynthesis. It does not generate glucose. All it generates is ATP. So the summary equation in cyclic photosynthesis is you do need light, which isn't shown here. The light energy is converted into the energy of ATP. And so ADP plus phosphate generates ATP in cyclic photosynthesis. All photosynthetic organisms that I know of, I should qualify it, that I know of, can engage in both cyclic photosynthesis and non-cyclic photosynthesis. If the green plant wants glucose, it will engage in non-cyclic photosynthesis. On the other hand, if the green plant wants ATP, it will engage in cyclic photosynthesis. Any question about that part? So, green plants can engage in both cyclic and non-cyclic photosynthesis, and they will do whichever photosynthesis they need to make the molecule that they want. All right, let's talk a little bit more about cyclic photosynthesis, which is also called cyclic photophosphorylation, because in cyclic photophosphorylation, phosphorylation is when you add a phosphate group right here to another molecule. So the making of ATP is a phosphorylation reaction. Any question about that? Probably I've just confused you. I probably just should have called it cyclic photosynthesis. But both terms are used, so you should be familiar with both terms. Cyclic photosynthesis begins when light hits the chlorophyll, and 2 electrons from the chlorophyll are then given the energy they need to move. The electrons enter an electron transport chain, which generates a proton motive force, which is used to generate ATP. Specifically, the light energy hits the chlorophyll in the photosystem, which is a bunch of proteins, but the chlorophyll is in that photosystem, and then those electrons move. They will move from the chlorophyll to this protein in the membrane, to that protein in the membrane, to that protein in the membrane, and then they move back to the photosystem and then move back to the chlorophyll. Okay? So the electrons end up where they started. Why it is called cyclic photophosphorylation or cyclic photosynthesis. The electrons move from chlorophyll and they move back to chlorophyll. Okay? Any question about that? As the electrons are moving through the proteins in the membrane, they give this protein the energy it needs to pump hydrogen ions from this side of the membrane to that side of the membrane. There will be a twofold gradient. There will be more hydrogen on this side of the gradient than that side, and there will be more positive charges on this side than on that side of the membrane. That is potential energy difference, and the cell uses this potential energy to generate ATP. The hydrogen ions will want to move from this side of the membrane to this side of the membrane, and they can only move through the membrane at this protein here, which is an ATP synthase. As the hydrogen ions move through this protein, it gives the protein the energy it needs to combine ADP and phosphate into ATP. And that is how cyclic photophosphorylation, or cyclic photosynthesis, converts light energy into the energy of ATP. And this should be familiar to you because this electron transport chain is similar to, but different, than the electron transport chain that we see in aerobic respiration. Meaning an electron is moving and it gives the proteins in the membrane the energy it needs to pump hydrogen ions from this side of the membrane to that side of the membrane. We have a twofold hydrogen ion gradient, which is used to make ATP at this protein, ATP synthase protein. Okay? Any question about that? Well, where does this happen in a plant cell? Where is this membrane? Does anybody know?
The
Yeah,
thylakoid?
in the thylakoid, the inner membrane of the chloroplast is where it happens in a eukaryotic cell. Where it is happening in a prokaryotic cell is that this membrane is the cell membrane of a prokaryotic cell. So in a prokaryotic cell, this will be inside the cell, and this will be outside the cell. Okay? And in a eukaryotic cell, this will be inside the inner membrane of the chloroplast, and then this will be the space between the inner membrane and the outer membrane, meaning someplace out here there will be the outer membrane of the chloroplast. All right? Any questions about cyclic photosynthesis? No questions? Then let's talk about the last slide. The requirements for producing ATP are in a summary given in this slide. The energy source or the electron donor can vary, but generally speaking, most of us will convert that molecule into glucose, and then the electrons will be stripped from the glucose to generate it.
Dexter, lay down. Dexter, lay down.
I'm sorry? Could you repeat that? Okay. Somebody I think was talking and didn't mean to. All right. The energy source doesn't have to be glucose. Even in you can use other food molecules. The chemosynthetic bacteria can use an inorganic chemical molecule like elemental sulfur, ammonia, or hydrogen gas. Green plants will use the sun for their energy source, and the electrons move in all cases to generate ATP. The electron carriers are generally NAD plus and FAD, and those are the only electron carriers you need to know about. In photosynthesis, the electron carrier is NADP plus, and you don't need to know that molecule, so I won't hold you to that. And then the final electron acceptors can vary. Let me get that out of the way. See if that's enough out of the way. Well, not quite. Let me end this slide. The final electron acceptors can vary. In aerobic respiration, the final electron acceptor will be oxygen. For anaerobic forms of respiration, the final electron acceptor will be some other molecule other than oxygen. It can be a nitrogen compound like nitrite or nitrate. It can be a sulfur compound like sulfate. But for fermentation, it will be an organic chemical compound. And for cyclic photosynthesis, it's not shown here, the final electron acceptor is what in cyclic photosynthesis? What's the last molecule to receive that electron? Come on, somebody remembers. The electron goes back to the chlorophyll. The point is that the energy source can vary and the final electron acceptor can also vary. Any questions about any of that? All right? If not, we're done. So I will see you next Monday.